Welcome to the 2022 Dean's Lecture Series in the Faculty of Human and Social Development. My name is Helga Holcomsdotter, and I'm the Dean of the faculty. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wisanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. On behalf of my colleagues in HSD, I would like to thank Joanne Clark, the Dean of Continuing Studies, and her colleagues for organizing this event. This is such a wonderful way to celebrate and highlight the research and scholarly work that define us in the Faculty of Human and Social Development. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Lindsay DuPré. Lindsay is a Métis scholar, community organizer, mom, and auntie. She was born and raised in Ontario on Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat territory with Red River Métis roots in Manitoba. Lindsay is an assistant teaching professor at the University of Victoria in the School of Public Health and Social Policy, where she teaches online. She is co-founder of the Mamawi Project and co-edited the text, Research and Reconciliation, Unsettling Ways of Knowing Through Indigenous Relationships. As you are about to discover, Professor DuPré is both a passionate and knowledgeable advocate for embedding reconciliation, social justice, and Indigenous knowledge into our learning spaces and practices in meaningful and sustainable ways. The title of Lindsay's talk is, Are We There Yet? Making Space for Indigenous Knowledge in Online Learning. In this talk, Lindsay addresses how, through evolving contexts of reconciliation and social justice movements, universities have become increasingly interested in developing Indigenous presence within their institution. This moment has presented opportunities for Indigenous peoples and knowledge to assert belonging within academic spaces, including offering new and old perspectives on teaching and learning. As online learning has become more common, particularly through the COVID-19 pandemic, new possibilities and challenges have emerged. This lecture will explore some of the tensions related to making space for Indigenous knowledge and the need for more deliberate protocols surrounding teaching and engaging with Indigenous knowledge in online learning. I hope you enjoy the 2022 Dean's Lecture in the Faculty of Human and Social Development.
Tanshikiyawao. My name is Lindsay DuPré, and I am an assistant teaching professor in the School of Public Health and Social Policy in the Faculty of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria. It's my pleasure to be a part of this year's Dean's Lecture Series and to share some of my questions and reflections around how we're making space for Indigenous knowledge in online learning. To tell you a little bit more about myself, I'm a Métis scholar. My Métis family is originally from Manitoba, connected to Red River settlement. However, I was born and raised in southern Ontario on Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Wendat territory, which is where I'm connecting today. I also carry various European ancestry. My mother's family are Irish settlers who settled in this area of southern Ontario and farmed here. I also carry deep relationships and responsibilities to Treaty 6 territory, where my partner and my son are members of Waterhen Lake First Nation. Alongside being an assistant teaching professor, I'm also in important roles such as mom and auntie. And in all of these roles, I'm exploring knowledge in ways where I'm simultaneously a teacher and a learner. This is an important ethic and perspective on processes of teaching that I bring into my work at the University of Victoria that guide me very much. I think that often when we watch lectures like this, we approach it thinking that we're going to be learning from an expert and that the person speaking to you is going to give you expertise and concrete ideas on how you should take particular sets of information and knowledge and apply it into your own contexts. I want to be clear today that I am by no means an expert in Indigenous knowledge and cultural teaching. As I said, I'm a teacher and a learner, and I would frame myself more as a knowledge facilitator in this space. And I try and carry out my responsibilities to Indigenous knowledge and to my own teachers by asking these questions and thinking about how we're protecting Indigenous knowledge within academic spaces. Today I'm going to share some of my questions that will hopefully bring you alongside me in thinking about these things and questioning very critically, how is this work contributing to broader movements of reconciliation, of justice, and of respecting self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. I'd like to provide some framing around the evolving learning contexts that are contributing to the tensions that we see today in bringing Indigenous knowledge within online learning. To start, there's been land-based teaching and learning happening on these territories now called Canada for millennia. Within this, there's been distinct protocols within Indigenous nations that tell us how to appropriately engage with knowledge and to learn in relationship to land and place, as well as through intergenerational knowledge transmission processes. Upon contact and the imposition of settler colonial violence, we have seen huge threats to Indigenous knowledge systems. And this is important to name because I think increasingly Canadians are becoming more aware of the harms of the residential school system and other colonial policies and structures that have harmed Indigenous peoples and life on these territories. However, often the attacks on Indigenous knowledge itself are overlooked. And when we're having these conversations within academic institutions, this is particularly relevant to us because despite our good intentions, I use our in this context of the universities and people working within it more broadly, despite our good intentions, there's ways that our approaches to incorporating Indigenous knowledge and engaging in reconciliation can actually be perpetuating settler colonial power structures and privileging Western epistemology while thinking of Indigenous knowledge truthfully as window dressing. Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and advocacy movements are relevant here as well because without this work, I wouldn't be sitting here and definitely wouldn't be exploring the type of ideas that I'm discussing with you today. Indigenous peoples have resisted generation after generation post-contact and have strategically found ways to survive and to breathe life into our knowledges each step of the way. Across every territory and sector, including higher education, you can find evidence of Indigenous innovation and grit. Digital technologies are being used in exciting ways within these movements and are helping us come into relation with Indigenous knowledge systems in new ways that can help us understand the complexities of our world. When we then look to reconciliation and diversity and equity inclusion priorities that have become more frequent within the past few years, we can see the positives of that and the ways that new possibilities and opportunities to get work done to advance Indigenous priorities has been possible. However, we also need to see that critical lens of, again, how sometimes this work can be a facade or can mask the ways that Western epistemologies and pedagogies are being privileged and protected while trying to frame it as centering Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing. So we need to keep listening to Indigenous scholars and experts outside of academic institutions as well to guide us in ways where we're not tricked by this idea of Indigenous education and presencing within academia. We're not tricked by that being the end goal. We need to think much more about our processes and ensure that we're doing it in meaningful ways. The last piece of context that I wanted to name today is the COVID-19 pandemic and technological innovation. So online learning has been happening and has been possible for decades now. However, in the past few years, we've seen rapid evolution in the tools that we are able to access to support this work. And with the pandemic, we suddenly had a very urgent priority around this because to keep us safe, we needed to transition our teaching and learning into online. And so with this has brought new challenges, and that rapid pace itself has been at the center of this. When we move so quickly to a different space for learning, we often are losing sight or we're not paying attention to just how important the context or the space and the place has been for learning. When moving teaching online, the learning experience changes. and digital technology becomes an active agent in filtering how we engage with one another and how we can build and can't build ideas. Each new function and platform developed changes the environment and how we can transmit information. In my experience, I've found this presents unique challenges to doing relational and emotion-informed teaching, which are central to Indigenous pedagogies. Indigenous knowledge is lived knowledge that emerges in relationship and thus requires relational accountability. Principles and protocols for engaging with Indigenous knowledge in person and on the land have developed over millennia, whereas our experience teaching online has only occurred over a few decades. This leads me back to the title of my presentation. When I included Are We There Yet?, I intended to trigger some memories for you, hopefully good ones, or challenging ones, of traveling with children. Whether you think about being the child yourself or you're the one driving, we can think of those memories where there's this excitement and enthusiasm and also impatience about trying to get to a final destination. I use that as an analogy for the work that's being done within academic institutions in relation to Indigenous knowledge, because I think it perfectly speaks to the need to focus on the journey rather than the final destination. So that pressure and that rush and that shoulder tapping, asking, are we there yet? It often distracts us from enjoying the ride and doing the work that needs to be done along the way. So rather than using the question, are we there yet? I actually want to reject my own title and change things to instead frame our questioning around how are we moving? How are we engaging in this journey of reconciliation and rebuilding and strengthening relationships to Indigenous knowledge in new ways, but according to protocols and priorities of Indigenous communities? I include a photo of my son here on this slide because I think my learning as a parent has taught me a lot about this focus on process. Toddlers are the best at teaching us to both slow down and speed up at the same time, to be patient, and to put care and curiosity into the ways we experience the world. Post-secondary institutions have the embracing curiosity part down, but when it comes to patience and care, there's a lot of unlearning and work left to do. Making space for Indigenous knowledge requires us to wade through the waters of epistemological conflict, to respond to the urgency of this work and the excitement toward where we're headed, while also slowing down enough to properly consider whether meaningful change is in fact happening, and whether we're actually moving anywhere at all. So here are some questions that I think can help us move. What is Indigenous content and what is Indigenous knowledge? Merely talking about colonization and Indigenous people's experiences pre and post contact is not itself engagement with Indigenous knowledge. There needs to be more widespread understanding of what Indigenous epistemologies are in order to appreciate the immense work and careful work that's needed to create space for them. I also ask, who defines what is considered authentic Indigenous knowledge and what processes need to be in place to do that? I also wonder, how do we hold ourselves accountable and our institutions accountable by protecting the integrity of Indigenous knowledge? Another context to this are the conversations happening right now around race shifting and identity fraud in relation to indigeneity. We really need to see the need for protection when it comes to knowledge, which often isn't talked about because many people believe that just making space and just having the intention to do so, those good intentions are enough. There are potential harms, and we need to think about what we need to do structurally to try and prevent those harms. How does inclusion in academic spaces that have been built around Western epistemologies and pedagogies pose risks of appropriation and exploitation of Indigenous knowledge? So inclusion in itself is not necessarily positive or supportive of Indigenous priorities and self-determination. We need to think really careful about this and ensure that the ways knowledge is being incorporated isn't distorting that knowledge or interrupting proper protocols. Another question I have is, what do responsible pedagogies look like for teachers and learners when engaging with Indigenous knowledge online? For me, I'm constantly thinking about all of the different intersecting connections to place. So where is the territory I'm based in and teaching from? Where are my students based and what territories are they within? What institutional connection to place is also at play here? So in working for the University of Victoria, what are my responsibilities in relationship to Lekwungen territory and the knowledges attached to their peoples? All of these things are happening simultaneously, and in an online space, that relationship to place is shifting. And so for me, being a responsible teacher in relationship to Indigenous knowledge requires some critical thinking around that. I by no means have a perfect answer for how to do that, but I think the more that we can think about that, the better we'll be at exploring place in online settings. How might online learning create new waterways for engaging with place? How can we attend to contexts of digital and social inequities within this work? Realizing that as we try and make space for Indigenous knowledge, there's many Indigenous peoples who do not have access to the same technology and access to bandwidth to participate in online learning that we're working on. How do we measure progress in this work without enabling neoliberal notions of success? This one is really important to me because it goes back to those concerns that I have around how reconciliation has been co-opted and appropriated across not only post-secondary, but in other sectors across Canada as well. How do we really root our understanding of success in line with goals driven by Indigenous peoples? This also leads me to reflect on my role as a teacher and how I'm evaluating students' learning. If we're shifting to Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies within some of the spaces of our institutions, that is going to require some changes to the way we even think about outcomes of courses and of programs, and again of what success really looks like and what learning, how learning takes form. I'm going to end there, again leaving you probably with more questions than answers, but I hope that you might walk away sitting with some of these and perhaps carrying them with you into your own work. I am so grateful to have been a part of this series and for the support that I've had from the School of Public Health and Social Policy to raise these questions and concerns and to do work in a way that I feel proud of. There's still so much that needs to be done, but I think that with the commitment to keep doing this work, we can really create these new learning environments in ways that can center Indigenous life and thought in really beautiful and nourishing ways. Merci, and take care.